My husband threw me out because of his son's lies. 3 weeks later, he asked if I'd done some reflecting. So I handed him my answer. You know that feeling when your entire life explodes in front of you, but you're too stunned to even scream? That was me. One minute I was standing in my driveway, watching my clothes fly out of my second-story window like confetti at the world's worst parade. My husband, Elijah, was up there screaming, his face red with a rage I'd never seen before, telling me to get out of his house. Except, it wasn't his house. It was mine. And right behind him, his 17-year-old son, Jake, stood there, a look on his face that was something between triumph and fake concern. He had his hand on Elijah's shoulder, playing the devoted son, but his eyes met mine for just a second through that window, and I swear I saw a smirk. That smirk told me everything. This wasn't a misunderstanding. This wasn't teenage drama. This was calculated, planned, executed perfectly by a kid who'd been playing chess while I was playing checkers. Let me back up and explain how a normal Tuesday morning turned into the day my marriage imploded. I'm Becky, 38 years old. I work in industrial equipment sales. It's the kind of job that pays well but makes people's eyes glaze over at parties. The most exciting part of my week is usually deciding which sandwich shop to hit for lunch. I met Elijah 4 years ago at a coffee shop. He was kind, steady, a widower who'd lost his wife to illness 3 years prior. His son Jake was 13 then, a quiet kid who seemed lost without his mother. I understood. Losing a parent at that age leaves marks. I fell for Elijah pretty much immediately. He had this way of making you feel like you were the only person in the room when he talked to you. We dated for 8 months before I proposed we build a life together. He said yes with tears in his eyes. I promised both of them I'd never try to replace Jake's mother, but I'd be there for them always. I meant it too. The first 2 years were honestly great. Jake was distant with me, sure, but I understood. I never pushed, never demanded he call me Mom. I helped him with homework, drove him to his friends' houses, paid for his phone and clothes without keeping score. When Elijah and I got married, I bought us a bigger house so Jake could have his own space, a proper bedroom, not the cramped room they'd had at Elijah's old apartment. Elijah was happy. We were happy. I thought Jake was adjusting. Looking back now, with perfect hindsight, I can see exactly when things started to shift. When the poison started dripping into our marriage, slow and steady, like water eroding stone. About 9 months ago, Jake started making these little comments to his father. I'd hear them sometimes when I walked into a room. Little things that sounded sweet on the surface, but had this edge underneath that made my skin crawl. He'd tell Elijah how handsome he looked, how he deserved someone who treated him like a king. At first, I thought it was just a kid complimenting his dad. Sweet, right? Then he'd bring up his late mother. Whenever Elijah and I set any kind of boundary, curfew, homework requirements, basic house rules, Jake would drop some variation of, Mom would have let me do this, or Mom understood me better. Elijah would shut it down at first, firmly, telling him that I was good to them and that comparing wasn't fair. But the comments kept coming, subtle and constant, wearing him down bit by bit. He'd question why they had to follow my rules in what he called their house. Never mind that I'd bought the house, that my name was on the deed, that I paid the mortgage every month without complaint. In Jake's version of reality, this was their house and I was just living in it. I tried talking to Elijah about it, suggested maybe Jake was having trouble adjusting, that we should consider family therapy. He waved it off as typical teenage drama and told me I was being too sensitive. But I noticed him looking at me differently sometimes, like he was studying me, searching for something, like Jake's words were planting seeds of doubt that were starting to sprout. Then, about 4 months ago, things got weirder in a way that made me feel genuinely crazy. Jake would be this completely different person depending on whether his father was in the room. When Elijah was around, he'd be laughing and joking with me, acting like we were buddies, calling me by my first name in this friendly way, asking about my day, seeming genuinely interested in my boring equipment sales stories. But the absolute second Elijah left the room, like the instant he was out of earshot, Jake's face would go blank, completely neutral, like someone had flipped a switch and turned off his personality. I'd try to engage with him, suggest activities we could do together, and he'd give me flat, one-word responses while staring at his phone. Then Elijah would come back and boom! Animated, friendly Jake would reappear like nothing happened. I started feeling insane, like I was imagining the whole thing, or reading too much into normal teenage moodiness. But the pattern was too consistent, too deliberate. This kid was performing for his father, and dropping the act the second he wasn't watching. The real explosion, the beginning of the end, started 3 months ago when Jake asked me for a car. Not just any car. A $35,000 BMW, like his friend Tyler had gotten for his 17th birthday. He showed me pictures on his phone, talking about how all his friends had nice cars and how he was embarrassed to have me drive him places in my old work truck. My truck was 3 years old and perfectly fine, but apparently it wasn't good enough for Jake's image. I sat him down at the kitchen table and tried to be reasonable. I explained that $35,000 was too much money for a teenager's first car. I told him we could find a reliable used car for around $10,000, something safe and dependable. I suggested he could get a part-time job to help with insurance payments, teach him some responsibility. He stared at me like I just suggested he walk everywhere barefoot. Then his face crumpled and he ran to his room where I could hear him crying. Loud, dramatic sobs that carried through the entire house. That night, Elijah was ice cold, questioning whether it was really necessary to deny him, pointing out everything Jake had been through. Losing his mother, having to adjust to a new family, asking if it would really kill me to just give him this one thing. I was shocked. 35 grand for a teenager's first car was objectively insane. I told Elijah that, tried to explain basic financial responsibility. He turned away from me in bed and said, I didn't understand what it was like to be Jake's father. After that incident, everything changed. Like someone had flipped a switch in our marriage, and suddenly I was the enemy. Jake started having these whispered conversations with Elijah that would stop abruptly when I entered rooms. I'd walk into the kitchen, and they'd both go quiet, looking at me like I'd interrupted something important. Elijah would give me this tight smile and change the subject, but the damage was done. He began questioning me out of nowhere, asking if I really liked Jake, why Jake felt like I was different when Elijah wasn't around, whether I resented having him in our lives. Every time I tried to defend myself, he'd counter with, why would my son lie about this? And that's the trap, right? How do you defend yourself against vague accusations? How do you prove you didn't say something mean, or give someone a certain look? Jake was making claims that were impossible to disprove, building this narrative of me as a two-faced jerk who only showed her true colors when we were alone. The fights became regular occurrences. At least twice a week, Elijah would confront me about something Jake had said. That I'd snapped at him for leaving dishes in the sink, that I'd made a comment about his grades, that I'd rolled my eyes when he asked for something. None of it was true. But every time I tried to defend myself, Elijah would ask if I was calling his son a liar. And what was I supposed to say to that? I realized pretty quickly that Jake was playing this perfectly, never making accusations so specific I could disprove them, but consistent enough that Elijah started believing the pattern. He was building a case against me, one small lie at a time. Then, 2 weeks ago, everything exploded in the absolute worst way possible. I came home from work around 6 p.m., tired from dealing with a difficult client all day. Elijah was waiting by the door, and the look on his face made my stomach drop. He grabbed my arm. Not gentle, not affectionate. Grabbed it hard enough that I knew something was very wrong. His voice was shaking as he told me we needed to talk about what happened with Jake. I had no idea what he was talking about. I'd been at work since 7 that morning. Hadn't even seen Jake. He pulled me into the living room where Jake was sitting on the couch, and my confusion turned to panic when I saw his face. He looked scared, actually frightened, eyes wide and a bit red like he'd been crying. Elijah pulled up Jake's sleeve to show me a bruise on his forearm, dark purple, about the size of a hand. He had tears in his eyes as he said, Jake told him I'd grabbed him that morning, that I'd been getting aggressive when he wasn't home, that Jake was scared to be alone with me. My world tilted. The room seemed to spin as I tried to process what he was saying. I have never ever laid a hand on that kid. Never. Not once in 4 years. I was shouting now, desperate, telling Elijah it wasn't true, that I'd never touched him, that I'd been at work all day, that he could check the timestamps on my badge swipes at the office if he didn't believe me. But he stepped back from me like I was dangerous, like I was some stranger who just threatened his family. He told me he hadn't wanted to believe Jake, that for months Jake had been telling him things, and he told himself his son was just being a dramatic teenager. But the things Jake was saying were too specific, too consistent to ignore anymore. I grabbed Elijah's hands, begging him to really think about whether he'd ever seen me be violent in 4 years together, to consider that maybe something else was going on here. He pulled away and said, "That was what made it so scary, that Jake claimed I was like 2 different people." That's when I saw him. Jake still sitting on the couch, watching this entire scene unfold. For just a split second, maybe half a second, his expression was completely neutral, almost curious, like he was watching a science experiment to see how it would turn out. Then he saw me looking, and his face instantly crumpled into fear. He ran to his father, calling for him, saying he'd heard yelling and begging him not to let me hurt him. That performance was what broke Elijah completely. He told me to pack a bag and leave, said he needed time to figure things out and make sure his son was safe, that I needed to get out of the house until he could think clearly. I packed with shaking hands, my mind reeling, throwing clothes into trash bags because I couldn't find my suitcase. As I loaded my car in the driveway, I looked up one more time and saw them in the upstairs window. Jake had his arm around his father, comforting him like the devoted son. But when he thought I couldn't see his face clearly through the glass, I caught him looking down at his phone and smiling. That smile confirmed what I already knew in my gut. This wasn't a misunderstanding. This wasn't a troubled kid acting out. This was calculated, planned, executed. And as I drove to my brother Dave's house with my entire life in trash bags in my back seat, one question kept hammering in my mind. How long had this 17-year-old been planning to destroy my marriage? And more importantly, why? I spent the first week at Dave's house in complete shock. Barely eating, barely sleeping, just replaying everything over and over like a broken film reel. Trying to find the moment I'd missed, the warning sign I should have seen. Dave kept telling me to fight back, to call Elijah, to make him listen. But what was the point? He'd already decided I was the monster in this story. No amount of talking would change that. I called Elijah maybe 50 times that first week. Every single call went straight to voicemail. I texted him, begging for a chance to talk, to explain, to show him that something was very wrong with this situation. He never responded. By the second week, the shock started wearing off and something else took its place. Something cold and analytical. I started thinking about all those little moments over the past months, connecting dots I hadn't even known were there. Jake's perfect performance on the stairs. That split second of curiosity before he put on his terrified act. That was too smooth to be his first time. He'd practiced that. The bruise on his arm that appeared at the perfect time, right after our biggest fight about the car. Too convenient. Those whispered conversations with Elijah that stopped when I entered rooms. What had he been filling his father's head with all those months? I realized I needed help. Real professional help. Because if Jake had been manipulating the situation the whole time, I needed proof. Solid, undeniable proof. I called a lawyer first, a family law attorney named Patricia Thompson, who came highly recommended from a woman at work who'd gone through a messy divorce. She listened to my story without interrupting, taking notes on a yellow legal pad. When I finished, she looked at me seriously and asked one question. "Do you own the house?" I told her yes. I'd bought it before the marriage with my own money. My name was the only one on the deed. She nodded and said that was good, that it gave me leverage, but we needed to move quickly on divorce paperwork if that's what I wanted. I told her I wasn't sure yet. That part of me still hoped Elijah would come to his senses. Patricia gave me this sad smile and said, "In my experience, when someone chooses to believe the worst about you without evidence, they've already made their choice." That hit me hard, but I knew she was right. Then I did something that felt crazy but necessary. I hired a tech consultant, a guy named Brandon, who'd helped Dave's company recover data after a cyber attack. I explained the situation and asked if there was any way to legally access Jake's digital footprint. Brandon didn't seem surprised at all. "Teenagers leave digital trails everywhere," he said. "Social media, cloud storage, messaging apps. If he's been planning this, there's evidence somewhere. Question is whether we can access it legally." He explained that as a minor living in my house, technically still my house since I owned it, there were legal gray areas around accessing devices and accounts, especially if I could make a case for concern about his well-being. Felt invasive. Felt wrong. But I needed to know the truth. "Let me look into your phone records first," Brandon suggested. "See what we can pull from your family plan. No hacking required for that. It's your account." It took Brandon less than a week to find the first bombshell. He called me on a Thursday evening, his voice tense. "You need to see this. Can you come to my office?" I drove over immediately. Brandon had printouts spread across his desk. Phone records, bank statements he'd helped me pull from accounts I had legal access to. Our joint account, the one Elijah and I had set up for household expenses and savings, had been bleeding money for almost 6 months, $8,000 in total, withdrawn in increments small enough that I hadn't noticed while working 60-hour weeks, and trusting my husband to manage the household finances. The charges were for gaming equipment, expensive clothes, electronics, food delivery, sometimes twice a day. All of it tied back to Jake's spending. But here's what made my blood run cold. Elijah had to have known. Several of the charges required parental approval for a minor. Bank statements showed he'd transferred money from our savings to cover overdrafts Jake had created. He'd been hiding it from me. Covering for him, probably because he knew I'd say no to that kind of frivolous spending. Brandon found something else, too. He pulled our credit report, perfectly legal since it was my credit, and found that Elijah had applied for a credit card in just his name 2 months ago, right around when Jake's campaign against me had intensified. He'd maxed it out almost immediately, another $4,000, mostly on stuff for Jake. When Brandon showed me everything, I felt physically sick. This wasn't just Jake manipulating his father. Elijah had been actively deceiving me too, choosing his son over our marriage and our financial future. "There's more," Brandon said, pulling up something on his laptop. "Your family phone plan includes cloud backup for all devices. Jake's phone has been backing up to your account this whole time." He showed me the data. Deleted text messages that had been automatically backed up before Jake erased them from his phone. Messages between Jake and his friends going back almost a year talking about his plan. "Mom's starting to doubt her." One message from 8 months ago said, "Just got to push a little harder and the old lady's gone." In another conversation from 6 months ago, Jake had literally written out his strategy to a friend named Tyler. "Dad always believes me when I cry. It's so easy." There were messages about the car too. About how I was a cheap jerk who didn't understand that Jake deserved nice things. About how once I was gone, his dad would finally sell that boring house, and they could move to the city where Tyler and his other friends lived. But the worst message, the one that made everything crystal clear, was from 3 weeks ago, right before everything exploded. "Almost there." Jake had written to Tyler. "Got the bruise ready. Going to show Dad tonight. This should be the final nail." He'd planned the bruise. He deliberately hurt himself to frame me. "I need you to see something else," Brandon said quietly, clicking on a video file. This was in his cloud storage, probably recorded by accident. Looks like he meant to take a photo but hit video instead. The video showed Jake in his bathroom alone. He was looking at his forearm, then deliberately slamming it against the edge of the bathroom counter, wincing, but doing it again and again until a dark bruise started forming. "This better work," he muttered to himself in the video. I sat there watching this 17-year-old kid abuse himself to destroy my marriage, and I felt physically sick. What kind of person does this? What had I done to deserve this level of calculated cruelty? Brandon showed me more messages, conversations between Jake and Tyler about their plan for after the divorce. "Once they split, Dad will want to leave this boring town," Jake had written. "He'll sell the house and we can finally move to the city where everything actually happens. Plus, without her around, he'll have more money to spend on me." It was all about money and location. Jake wanted a different life. A more exciting life in the city where his friends had moved after graduation, and I was the obstacle. The house was in my name, so Elijah couldn't sell it while we were married. But if we divorced, Jake figured his dad would want a fresh start somewhere else. He'd finally get what he wanted, and I'd be erased from their lives like I'd never existed. I had everything now. The financial deception, the manipulative messages, the video of him creating the bruise. All of it backed up and documented and completely legal since it was all from accounts and devices on my family plan. Patricia Thompson looked over everything and told me this was more than enough for a divorce with a very favorable settlement. "This is actually one of the clearest cases of fraud and manipulation I've seen," she said. "The video alone is damning." She warned me, though, that exposing Jake's manipulation might damage my relationship with Elijah permanently. I almost laughed. What relationship? The man had thrown me out based on lies without even giving me a chance to defend myself. He'd chosen his son over 4 years of marriage without a second thought. That night, 3 weeks after he'd kicked me out, I finally got a text from Elijah. "Have you had time to think about your behavior?" It read, "Jake says he's willing to give you another chance if you apologize to him and commit to doing better. We can talk about you coming home if you've really reflected on what you've done." I stared at that message for a long time. He wasn't asking if I was okay. He wasn't apologizing for not hearing my side. He was demanding I apologize to the kid who'd orchestrated this entire nightmare. The kid who'd stolen $8,000. The kid who bruised himself to frame me for abuse. The kid who'd been planning my removal from their lives for almost a year. I texted back just 4 words. "Come over tomorrow 3 p.m. He responded immediately. "Does this mean you're ready to make things right?" I didn't answer. Instead, I spent the rest of the night organizing all the evidence into a folder, printing out the messages, the bank statements, the credit card bills, everything. Brandon had even put the video on a USB drive for me. Tomorrow, Elijah was going to learn the truth about his son, and our marriage was going to end. There was no coming back from this. Elijah arrived at the coffee shop at exactly 3 p.m. I'd chosen this location deliberately. Neutral territory, public space, plenty of witnesses. I wanted him to see everything with other people around so he couldn't make a scene or accuse me of intimidating him. I watched him through the window as he parked. He looked tired, thinner than I remembered, with dark circles under his eyes that grooming couldn't quite hide. For a moment, I felt a pang of something like the love I'd had for him. Then I remembered 3 weeks of silence, the accusations, the way he'd chosen to believe the worst of me without question. He walked in with this expression on his face, half hopeful, half nervous, probably expecting me to be broken and apologetic, ready to beg for forgiveness. The coffee shop was busy enough for privacy, but not so empty we were alone. I'd positioned myself at a corner table where I could see the parking lot through the window. He slid into the seat across from me with a cautious smile, and immediately started talking about how he and Jake had been discussing things. How maybe if I was willing to go to therapy and work on my anger issues, we could find a way forward. I let him talk for about 30 seconds before I held up my hand to stop him. Then I slid a large manila folder across the table. He looked at it, confused, then back at me. "Open it," I said flatly. He hesitated, then picked up the folder with shaking hands. The first thing he saw was the divorce paperwork, officially stamped by the courthouse, already signed by my lawyer. His face went white. He looked up at me with genuine shock, starting to say, "We can work through." "Keep looking," I interrupted. He flipped through the pages. I watched his face change as he saw the bank statements, the credit card bills, the highlighted charges showing $8,000 of our money spent by Jake over 6 months. "I can explain," he started. "Keep going." Then he got to the printed messages, Jake's conversations with his friends, where he'd laid out his entire manipulation strategy. I saw the exact moment Elijah read the words his son had written about how easy it was to make him believe him, about how the old woman would be gone soon. His hands started trembling. He kept shaking his head like he could deny what was right in front of him. "These can't be real," he whispered. "These could be faked." That's when I pulled out my phone and played the video. The volume was low enough that only he could hear it. Jake's voice came through clearly as he slammed his own arm against the bathroom counter over and over, creating the bruise he'd shown his father. "This better work," his voice said from the phone. Elijah's face crumbled. He dropped the papers onto the table, his hand over his mouth, mumbling about how Jake had told him I grabbed him, how he cried, how scared he seemed. "He played you," I said coldly. "For months he systematically destroyed our marriage because he wanted you to sell my house and move to the city with him. It's all there in the messages." He was silent for a few seconds, staring at nothing. Then he started whispering, "No, no, no," over and over. His entire world was cracking open in real time. When he finally looked back at me, tears were streaming down his face. "Why didn't you make me see?" he asked through sobs. "Why didn't you tell me?" That question broke something in me. "I tried," I said, my voice hard. "I begged you to talk to me. Called you 50 times. You wouldn't even answer. You chose to believe Jake without evidence, without even asking for my side." You threw me out of my own house based on lies. He reached across the table for my hand. I pulled back before he could touch me. I was protecting my son, he said desperately. What was I supposed to do? You were supposed to be my husband, I said, my voice rising slightly before I caught myself. You were supposed to give me the benefit of the doubt after 4 years of marriage. You were supposed to ask questions, demand proof, something. But you didn't, because deep down you'd already chosen Jake over me. The truth hung between us like smoke. He had made his choice weeks ago, maybe months ago, when Jake's whispered poison first started working on him. I was just collateral damage. That's when the coffee shop door slammed open with force. Jake walked in. He'd apparently been waiting in the car outside and couldn't stand not knowing what was happening. He spotted us immediately and stormed over, his face red with anger. What are you doing to my dad? He demanded, loudly enough that other customers turned their heads. Then he saw the papers scattered on the table. His expression changed for just a second, real fear flashing across his face before he tried to recover. Whatever she's telling you is a lie, Jake said quickly to his father. She's trying to turn you against me. This is exactly what I warned you about. I picked up my phone and turned the screen toward him. The video of him creating the bruise was paused on the frame where you could clearly see his face. Jake's expression went through shock, panic, then settled on anger. You went through my stuff, he shouted. You had no right. That's illegal. You framed me for abuse, I said calmly. So I had every right. Elijah was staring at his son like he'd never seen him before. Tell me it's not real, he begged, his voice breaking. Tell me you didn't do this. And that's when Jake's mask finally came off completely. So what if I did? He said, his voice getting louder. You were miserable with her anyway. She's boring. She's cheap. And she's not Mom. We should have left this stupid town a year ago. Elijah gasped like he'd been punched in the chest, his eyes darting around at the other customers who were now openly staring. Jake kept going, seemingly not caring about the audience. He said all his friends had moved to the city after graduating, and he was stuck here because of me. He said Elijah deserved better than this boring life that they both did. Once the divorce went through and the house sold, they could finally have a real life. It's my house, I interrupted quietly. Elijah can't sell it. Jake froze. His face turned red again. He started sputtering something about lawsuits, about how his friend's mom got half of everything in her divorce, about how there were laws. That's when I saw it. The moment Elijah finally understood what his son had become. He looked pale, defeated, and so old all at once. You destroyed my marriage, Elijah whispered. For money and a change of location. You made me believe Becky was abusing you so we could move to be near your friends. Jake's jaw dropped and then he tried to backtrack, realizing how bad it sounded out loud. It wasn't like that. I just wanted us to be happy. She was ruining everything. I stood up slowly, pushing the folder toward Elijah. You have 30 days to find a place, I said firmly but quietly. It's stated in the divorce papers. After that, I'm taking back my house. Elijah looked at me devastated. Please, he begged. Give me time to process this, to fix what's broken. But I was done. There's nothing to fix, I said. You chose to believe I was a monster without evidence. You let your son manipulate you for months and never once questioned it. Even now, knowing the truth, you're asking me for another chance. But you never gave me a first one. He broke down completely, sobbing into his hands, while Jake stood there with his arms crossed, still defiant and angry, even though his entire scheme had collapsed around him. I looked at them, this father and son who destroyed my trust, my marriage, and felt nothing but emptiness where love used to be. I gathered my copy of the divorce papers, turned to Elijah one last time and said quietly, 30 days. Then I walked toward the exit. Behind me, I could hear Elijah's sobs and Jake starting to argue with him, his voice rising as he probably tried to spin this somehow, make it my fault again. I didn't look back. I walked out of that coffee shop, got in my car, and through the window I could see them still at the table. Elijah with his head in his hands, crying while Jake gestured angrily, probably still blaming me for everything, even as the evidence of his manipulation sat right there in front of them. A month later, my lawyer called to confirm they'd moved out on time. They'd found a small 2-bedroom apartment across town. Nothing like the house they'd left behind. Patricia mentioned that Elijah had tried to fight for some financial settlement, but he had no legal ground to stand on. The house was mine before the marriage, bought with my money, and he'd been complicit in the theft of $8,000 from our joint account. Dave told me through mutual friends that Elijah was devastated, barely functioning at work, that Jake was making his life miserable, blaming him for not moving faster, for not selling the house somehow, for ruining his plan. Their relationship was apparently strained to the breaking point. Jake was treating him with the same manipulative contempt he'd shown me now that his scheme had failed, and he was stuck in the same boring town he'd tried so hard to escape. Part of me felt sad about it sometimes, late at night when my house was too quiet, and I'd remember the good times before Jake's poison had taken root. But mostly I felt relief, like I dodged something that would have eventually destroyed me completely. You can't build a marriage with someone who doesn't trust you, and you can't love someone who will throw you away the moment it becomes convenient. I'd learned the hardest lesson of my life. Have you ever had someone so intent on destroying your life that they go to extreme lengths, even harming themselves, to frame you? What would you have done in my shoes? Tell me your thoughts in the comments below. I really want to know.